Turbulence in US-Turkey relations. The Pentagon suspends delivery of F-35 fighter jets following Turkey's intent to install a Russian missile defense system. I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is the F-35 deal or no deal? The relationship between the United States and Turkey, which once was flying high, now appears to be losing altitude, and fast. The last tension was ignited over Ankara's purchase of a Russian-built missile defense system. Turkey's president flew to Moscow this week to meet his Russian counterpart about the deal. But it has outraged Washington, which has reacted by hitting the emergency brake on its transfer of the latest American-made F-35 jets to Turkey. Turkey says the S-400 missiles are a done deal, but the US says Turkey can't have both. So could these two NATO allies be heading for a crash landing? That debate in a moment. But first, this report by Denise Savoya.
For the past several months, the United States and Turkey have been locked in a diplomatic standoff. At issue are two big arms deals being pursued by Ankara. Turkey wants to buy Russia's S-400 missile defense system in a deal reportedly worth $2.5 billion. It also wants to buy at least 100 American F-35 fighter jets. That deal is worth $12 billion. But Washington says it can't have both.
Turkey must choose. Does it want to remain a critical partner of the most successful military alliance in the history of the world? Or does it want to risk the security of that partnership by making reckless decisions that undermine our alliance?
Russia says its S-400 is designed to detect and shoot down stealth fighters like the F-35. The US is concerned that by allowing Turkey to have both systems, Moscow could use the S-400 radar to learn the F-35's weaknesses.
The S-400 is a computer. The F-35 is a computer. You don't hook your computer to your adversary's computer, and that's basically what we would be doing.
Turkey is not simply the buyer in this exchange. It's a key part of the F-35 program. 8 Turkish companies have been involved in the jet's development and the manufacturing of parts. Blocking Turkey from buying the F-35s could put the entire program at risk. In January, the Trump administration tried to derail Turkey's deal with Russia by offering Ankara its own $3.5 billion Patriot surface-to-air missile system at a discounted price. But that offer expired on March 31, and the next day the US made good on its threat by halting delivery of equipment related to the F-35 program. But Turkey is showing no signs of backing down.
Ve biz bu konuyla ilgili olarak bir şeyin akdini yapmışsak, sözleşmesini yapmışsak bu iş bitmiştir. Ona göre biz yolumuza devam ediyoruz, devam edeceğiz ve bu da bizim egemenlik hakkımızdır. Bu bizim tasarrufumuzdur. Bundan kimse bizden vazgeçmemizi isteyemez.
Nonetheless, the US appears hopeful of a breakthrough.
We are continuing to have conversations. I think the Turkish government understands the American position quite clearly. I'm very confident we'll find a path forward.
Ankara's critics say they're putting the NATO alliance at risk, but Turkey's foreign minister says the country should not have to choose between the US and Russia.
Any country in our region actually has no other options but should balance its relations with everybody in the region. And our relations with Russia is not an alternative to NATO alliance.
And now, both sides are waiting for the other's next move. Denise Savoya, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Washington, D.C. is retired U.S. Army Brigadier General Mark Kimitz. In London, we have former Kremlin advisor Alexander Nekrasov. And in the Turkish city of Gaziantep is Murat Aslan. He led the intelligence division within the Turkish Armed Forces and is now a security researcher at think tank the SETA Foundation. Gentlemen, thanks for joining us. General Kimitz, why can't Turkey have both the F-35s and the S-400 system? What's the problem?
Well, it's not a problem. It's an intelligence concern. The fact remains that the radar system for the S-400 is a learning instrument, and the more that the F-35 would be flying under that radar, the more our adversaries that use the S-400 could determine its capabilities. Now, that's not to suggest for a moment that Turkey is an adversary, but I don't think we're confident that what would be delivered to Turkey would not have the ability to have that data sent back to the Russian military.
General Kimmett, it's more about politics, isn't it? It's less about the technical aspects of defense capability or an intelligence threat. And it's, hey, don't do business with Russia. We're part of the same club. We're NATO. Why are you doing business with the very country that NATO was set up to fight? Isn't that it?
No, I don't think it's that at all. If you take a look at the number of the NATO countries that do have weapons systems that have been made elsewhere. For example, Greece uses the Russian S-300. We have no concerns with that, but the S-400 is incompatible with NATO systems and incompatible with a NATO commitment not only to protect American F-35s, but all the countries in NATO that use F-35s as well.
Murat Aslan, Turkey is jeopardizing NATO's security umbrella by doing this deal, and that's why the Americans have a problem with it. That's why Mike Pence is saying Turkey must choose. What do you think?
Well, actually, I don't see this issue as a technical issue or as a threat to intelligence architecture or protection or force protection of the NATO forces. The initial issue is that every aircraft has an intelligence signature in the air, not by the radars observing it, watching it, but actually by the radiation that it reflects. What I mean is that F-35 is actually radiating by means of receivers or other apparatus that is mounted on it, which means S-400 is also capable of capturing any other signature, not only the aircraft itself. The second issue, we know that S-300 has the same infrastructure with the S-400s in terms of radar and also the other equipment that is attached or embedded, which means Greece, for instance, has S-300 and can easily capture F-35 if S-400 does the same thing. And we know that in the Iniakos exercise in Crete, F-35 of Italians were sent over there, and S-300 were run.
Okay.
And we know that if there is a secrecy, that means we should say goodbye.
Okay, I'm going to get General Kimmett to respond in a moment, but I want to bring in Alexander Nekrasov to talk about the Russian angle, because there's a fear, and a lot of commentators have said this, especially US commentators. They feel that Putin has enjoyed this, selling the S-400s to Turkey, because it's allowed him to drive a wedge between Turkey and NATO, and that's ultimately the Russian goal, to create that sense of chaos between Turkey and its NATO allies. Is that what the Russians are doing?
Well, I don't see that as an attempt to drive a wedge between Turkey and NATO, because first of all, it's impossible to do that. Turkey will remain a member of NATO, and a sale of a defensive system, it is a defensive system, we must stress that, like S-400, is not going to change anything. So I think this is more to do about politics. I think the Americans are furious simply because it's that sort of attitude in Washington that NATO is our alliance and nobody can dictate anything to our alliance, only we can do that. Unfortunately, the Americans have a problem. They are selling outdated, not the modern equipment to the allies on many occasions. And this is a case when Turkey probably made the right choice, because the Patriot, the previous models, are not as good as the S-400. So why should Turkey pay money for an old product when it can get a better one? That's a very simple, very pragmatic decision. And the Americans should stop playing these games.
Okay, Mark Kimmett, it's practical. The Russians have a better missile defense system, no more, no less.
Well, to your commentator in Ankara, technically he's wrong. To your commentator in Russia, politically he's wrong. It's that simple.
Why?
Well, in the case of the politics, it is clear that President Putin has been doing everything in his power to drive a wedge in NATO. He's trying to do it up in the Baltics, he's trying to do it in the area around Ukraine, and he also sees Turkey as an opportunity to take advantage of the disputes that the United States has with Turkey, which we would like to solve in America, and I think the Turkish government would like to solve in Ankara. But the fact remains is when you have this aggravating country, Russia, trying to make things worse between us rather than make things better, that's the politics of what we're seeing here. I hope everybody in Turkey certainly realizes that President Putin and Russia don't give a damn about Turkey except as a tool in their overall geopolitical game that they're playing with the rest of the world.
And why is Murat Aslan wrong technically?
Well, I don't want to get into too many of the security aspects, but the fact remains is he says it has a radiating signature. The fact is it's a stealth aircraft, and let me leave it at that.
Okay, let me go to Murat Aslan and say, well, listen, this seems to be less about the incompatibility of having the F-35s and the S-400s at the same time, and rather maybe just the incompatibility of the United States and Turkey as things stand right now. Whether it comes to the US supporting the YPG, whether it comes to not extraditing Fethullah Gulen and so on. We're just at a point in the relationship where the two are in a toxic relationship and maybe they need to think about breaking up. Is that what we're talking about essentially?
Well, I care intentions and perceptions. In terms of intentions, we know that it's the United States who rejected Turkey to give Patriots at the initial stage of Turkish air defense program. And we still do not know why. And the second issue, Turkey was in deep need of procuring an air defense system for urgent needs because we know the developments in the Middle East and we know the facts about the potential missile threat in the Middle East. The second issue, it's about perception of both sides. We know that the United States has long been perceiving Turkey as different from the other allies because the interests of both sides are conflicting. And for Turkey, Turkey perceives the United States as the one who tolerated FETÖ, who tolerated PYD and PKK, and also remained silent, especially after July 15th, which means there must be a trust, though trust has been eroded after 2016. And before that, Obama administration frequently repelled Turkey from the scene. So that's why Turkey started a self-help system that Turkey should not be dependent on any other country, including the United States, and started national air defense program and also procured alternative ones.
Mark Kimmett, is this, rather than being the latest trigger, is it just the latest symptom in a relationship that has been breaking down for a few years now?
Well, I agree with both you and your commentator in Ankara. Look, you can't ignore the fact that there have been some aggravating issues between the United States and Turkey. I think both sides are doing their best to try to work them out, but they are, in many ways, nowhere close to being solved, particularly the issue with the PYD inside of Syria. We do know that there are talks going on between the Turkish military and the U.S. military right now on the establishment of a safe zone, and we hope that takes care of some of those issues. With regards to the coup, we've been silent because the United States was not part of the coup. Some would suggest we were. We're not even going to, as we say, dignify that comment with a response. On the issue of Gulen, we are working very carefully with the legal authorities to ensure that his asylum rights are respected the way that any asylum rights of an American citizen inside of Turkey would be protected as well. So look, these are aggravating situations, but this latest issue with the S-400 and the Patriot system and Russia are something that are just aggravating the situation even more, and obviously the United States would like to find a method to ensure we resolve this issue as well.
Alexander Nekrasov, beyond the choice of whether Turkey should go for the S-400s or the Patriots and the technicalities and what's better and what's cheaper and so on, politically, what does What has Russia got to offer that's better than what the US and NATO have got to offer for Turkey?
Well, first of all, NATO and America especially are currently the biggest danger in the world. Let's not forget, by the way, that 2 world wars have been started by the West, or in the West, we would put it this way. So the West is always a danger. And the way the West conducts business now, be it the Middle East, Europe, or any other part of the world, this is very dangerous. The Trump administration's foreign policy, nobody knows what it is. They change their minds all the time. How can Turkey depend on an administration in Washington that is battling with each other, that is fighting, a political war with its opposition in Congress and so on? This is very unstable time. Russia at least is stable. That is very important, I think, for Turkey to understand that they're dealing with a stable leadership. And all this nonsense that Russia poses a threat to Europe, the world, comes from, it's like Hitleresque propaganda. That has to stop. This lying has to stop. Our colleague from Washington, he needs to understand propaganda is not an opinion. If you say Russia is poses a danger to us, that is not your comment. That is part of the Western propaganda, and the West is the enemy of the world at the moment. All this liberal, democracy and so on, it doesn't work anymore.
General Kimmett,
the liberal economics is dead. So you're in agony and you are posing a danger to the world.
General Kimmett, are you just spreading Western propaganda here?
Well, actually, I'm enjoying this conversation tremendously. When Russia puts its troops into Syria to back up a butcher like Bashar al-Assad, well, now Russia puts its troops into Venezuela as the people are starving there, and their whole intent is to prop up a regime that is starving its own people. I would suggest that Russia, which is a small country with a declining population, which has the gross domestic product of Italy, I think it's lashing out in places such as Ukraine and the Baltics and elsewhere. It's just really sort of an issue of a dying country. To suggest that Turkey ought to get behind Russia because it promotes stability, I think getting behind Russia is like jumping on a sinking ship and going down with it.
Okay. Well, we've got both your opinions on the two nations. Let me sort of bring this all the way back to the beginning and ask Murat Aslan, as we look at what the US has said now, Turkey is deeply involved in the production also of the F-35, so it's not so easy to just kick them out of the loop here, right? Turkey prepares parts, it's involved financially and so on as part of the alliance. What should the next step be for President Erdogan? What does he do now that the Trump administration has played its card?
What is expected should be, compromise among all actors. Now, Turkey decided S400 procurement and also continues to support F-35. And I do not see any reasoning to change that path, because S-400 and F-35 are completely different issues, and Turkey can have the capacity to have incompatibility of all systems, in the inventory of Turkish armed forces, and I do not see any reasoning to have 35 be cancelled. But we know that Turkey have alternatives, and Turkey easily can procure another fighter jet that is equivalent to F-35. It will take a bit time, but sure, we will realize it. That means I do not see a reason for not compromising, but we have a road if anything occurs negatively.
General Kimmett, will there be compromise?
Well, I hope so, but I'm concerned that the article I read this morning in the New York Times, where senators from both sides of the aisle are now saying that if Turkey goes through the purchase of the S-400, with the purchase of the S-400, they will invoke CATSA, the Sanctions Act that has sanctioned Russia and anyone that deals with Russia. So what I'd hate to see is Turkey continuing to buy the S-400s and see sanctions imposed on it. So you really have a double whammy for Turkey, which I would like to see avoided and compromised. Number one, purchasing a system that puts their F-35s and all of NATO F-35s at risk. And number two, by purchasing from Russia, we would have to invoke the CATSA Act and potentially sanction Turkey with the inevitable results of a sanction regime on Turkey, which would follow.
Alexander Nekrasov, if the U.S. does sanction Turkey, what does that mean for Russia?
I don't think the U.S. will sanction Turkey simply because Turkey is too important. All this posturing, all this blackmail is typical American position. So I think Turkey should just continue as it is doing. Nothing will change. Americans will back down. Americans are weakened now, and this must be understood. And as for all this equipment, you must understand one thing. The Third World War will be a nuclear war. That's why Americans are so nervous. They're trying to invent this and that system and so on. The Russians have the most powerful now nuclear arsenal. It's modernized, it's ready for war. So Americans need to understand that. All their bases, all their flying machines, all their Patriot systems will not be saved in a nuclear conflict, and America will be destroyed as well. So they better deal with Russia on a friendly basis. They better remember that.
Okay, on that depressing note, I've got to wrap. Mark Kimmett, Alexander Nekrasov, and Murat Aslan. Listen, thanks for joining us once again. Still to come, the U.S. cuts aid as migrants continue to flee violence and poverty in Central America. But will Trump's decision stop them? And the Kingdom of Brunei introduces a new law that imposes death by stoning for gay sex and adultery. Could an international backlash stop the law in its tracks? The United States has slashed its financial assistance to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. President Donald Trump says he will no longer help these Central American countries because they haven't prevented people from leaving and attempting to enter the U.S. According to American officials, aid programs there have been trying to address the root causes of why people flee in the first place by providing security and employment. So, could cutting aid actually cause more migrants to leave? Or was the assistance making so little difference that it makes sense for Trump to cut costs? Randolph Nogel takes a look.
As recently as December, the U.S. and Mexico seemed to agree on tackling the root causes of illegal immigration from Central America. But now Donald Trump has gone back on that commitment by cutting hundreds of millions of dollars in aid to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, the latest in a series of abrupt and unexpected policy changes that are coming to define his presidency.
And I stopped paying almost $600 million to those three countries. Now I got a lot of heat. The Democrats say, how dare you do that?
In 2017, those three countries, known as the Northern Triangle, received more than $500 million from the U.S. Guatemala got $248 million, Honduras received $175 million, and El Salvador $115 million. Much of the money went to organizations working to create better economic and security conditions so that fewer people would migrate north. Former President Barack Obama convinced a Republican-controlled Congress in 2014 to double aid to the region. 5 years later, Trump has decided it's not worth the investment.
That money is used for all these good, but no, it's not. It's largely stolen. Now, if the government wanted to, I have a feeling they'd be able to stop caravans from forming in those three countries. I have a feeling.
While the development programs were geared for long-term results, there's evidence some were already working. Homicide rates in El Salvador dropped more than 60% in areas where the agency USAID operates. USAID support to Guatemala's court system is linked to a rise in convictions for extortion. And since 2011, US-sponsored agriculture investments has helped pull nearly 18,000 families in Honduras out of extreme poverty. Despite that, attempted crossings at the US-Mexico border have surged this year. If current rates are sustained, this year's total will get close to the historic peak in 2001 at 1.6 million attempted crossings.
No hay muro que nos detenga, haga lo que haga, migrantes siempre le van a llegar, porque nosotros la verdad en el país estamos fregados, estamos jodidos, no hay trabajo.
The Trump administration also wants to speed up the forced return of asylum seekers to their home countries by as much as 5 times the current rate. Critics say summarily rejecting asylum seekers is undermining any moral authority the US might have in pressuring other countries to uphold human rights. Meanwhile, thousands of migrants, many from Central America, are being held in US detention facilities.
They're being kept behind cages and in tents. This is no condition to keep families and babies, and the rhetoric that's being spread about these families is completely untrue and it's inhumane.
And as another caravan heads north, they're appealing for help, perhaps not to the US government, but to its people, in the hope that Trump is underestimating Americans' compassion for those who need asylum in a country that calls itself the land of the free. Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. I'm joined from Washington, D.C. by Ambassador Thomas Shannon. He's a former U.S. State Department counselor who led a delegation to the Northern Triangle under Obama. In Guatemala City, we have Congressman Fernando Linares Beltranena. And in Baltimore is Rick Jones. He's a longtime Central America aid worker with Catholic Relief Services. Rick Jones, let me start with you. Has the president made the wrong decision by deciding to cut aid to these 3 Central American countries?
Yes, I think we're sending the wrong message. You're telling people that help is not on the way, you're on your own, and more people are likely to leave. It's actually counterproductive to the goals of this administration of reducing migration. And we need to send a message that the aid is actually working. Homicides have actually dropped in El Salvador over the last 2 years, down 55%. The aid is working. We don't need to stop the aid. We need to increase it.
Fernando Linares Beltranena, is the aid working? Is this a bad decision?
I believe that we don't need aid. We can do very well on our own, and we have for years. The only way to reduce migration is not through aid. We don't want to be dependent on other people's money, but on economic growth. The only way to raise the real wages in Guatemala and El Salvador is through production. And production is achieved through investment and economic growth. We've been doing that. I think we are becoming a prosperous nation, and we don't need the aid, especially because many times the aid comes with strings attached.
Okay, Congressman, sorry to interrupt you. Just for a second, right? What happened to all the money then? I mean, are you, in a way, implying that the politicians in your country, Guatemala, and elsewhere have just siphoned the money and it's not actually gone to the development that would keep people at home?
Some money has gone, yes, to poor people who need it, but a lot of it has gone to economic intervention. Let me give you an example. USAID spent $15.6 million in legislative modifications in our country. It promoted constitutional reforms to change our legislation. This is a foreign intervention. It's not giving money to the poor, as the colleague in El Salvador says. That would be worthwhile. It's just that it's used for different political purposes.
Okay, let me ask Ambassador Thomas Shannon. So this is what the president tweeted, and he's very clear. He doesn't mince his words. You know where he stands on these things. He said, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador have taken our money for years and do nothing. The Dems don't care. Such bad laws may close the southern border. Does the president have a point?
Thank you very much. And thank you to Fernando and thank you to Rick for being present today, because they both present important points of view. But the president does have a point in the sense that he believes that sovereign nations have a right to determine who comes into their country, in this case the United States. But he also believes sovereign nations have an obligation to take care of their citizens so that they don't have to flee their country. The problem that we face in the Northern Triangle countries is that obligation is one thing, capacity is another. And I think what we've seen very clearly is that there are situations in Honduras, in El Salvador, and in Guatemala that are driving migration and driving people north, and driving them north in numbers and in unusual circumstances. In other words, children and family units, mothers with children, fathers with children. And this has created a very significant problem for us in our relationships with these countries, in our relationship with Mexico, and along our southwest border. And the United States has to find a way to deal with this. I understand the president's frustration, but Rick has it right. What we have been doing over the past several years is working with the Central American countries and aligning our assistance with the priorities that those countries have established under the Alliance for Prosperity. And those have been having an impact in the short to medium term in terms of affecting the conditions on the ground. But we still have a lot to do.
Right. Okay, so Rick Jones, this money that will be cut is between $450 and $700 million, depending on who you ask. Everybody has different metrics and parameters for this. Why don't you tell Fernando directly, the congressman from Guatemala, tell him why you think that money is necessary for those people, to either stop those people going across the border or to help them and pave the way for them, because he's saying that money is not necessary and they don't need it. Address him directly, Rick.
I think, Congressman, the GDP is not a substitute for aid. Aid, when it's well-directed, reaches the poorest who are not part of the economic growth. For example, people in the Western Highlands growing corn and beans are not part of the larger economic system in Guatemala. And the aid assistance that reaches children to prevent them from stunting is critical. And the aid that is helping young people get jobs in El Salvador and Honduras is critical. These are the marginal kids who are out of school and unemployed, and no one is willing to pay for that. So I think the aid, when it's well directed, is essential. And without that kind of aid, we're going to see thousands more children in Guatemala who suffer from severe malnutrition and stunting. We're going to see fewer young people prepared for the workforce, and we're likely to see homicides rise instead of going down.
Congressman?
No, I believe that we have our own social problems for extreme. But I believe that the best social program is a job. And the way to create jobs is through economic investment, not through dependency on foreign aid. What we want is for our people to get on their own feet and go forward. And that is what the U.S. achieved 100 years ago when it also was an underdeveloped country. So we don't want to depend on aid. We don't want to be subsidized. We don't want to be panhandlers. And even though I recognize that in the short run, aid can be beneficial, we have our own program. The problem is that very many times aid is not well directed. It comes with conditions. It comes with manipulation of our politics. The example is well stated. $15.6 million to revamp our judicial structure. And that included constitutional reforms which try to promote indigenous legislation. Right. That is a political agenda. It has nothing to do. You see, you're looking at aid because you see an impoverished child. Sure, you want to feed the child. We want to feed the child too. But the aid is not being used for that. It's siphoned away to other political projects.
Okay, so let's ask. Let's ask Ambassador Shannon. And just, I don't want to kind of go down this road too far, but Ambassador Shannon, were heavy strings attached to the aid, and was it being used as a political weapon in the region?
The conditions that were imposed by the U.S. Congress were really a series of certification requirements that indicated that the countries of the Northern Triangle were making progress in addressing issues that they themselves had identified, especially in the area of corruption and law enforcement and fighting crime and promoting human rights. In other words, these weren't conditions that were imposed. They were conditions that were negotiated and agreed to and became the basis by which the U.S. Congress was prepared to make a financial commitment to those countries. I admire what the congressman is saying. I admire his determination to have Guatemala, in his case, on its own feet. And this is obviously our goal, too, in the Northern Triangle. And this is one of the reasons why the United States negotiated a free trade agreement with the Central American countries and have provided other kinds of assistance and investment opportunities in Guatemala, in El Salvador, and in Honduras in order to generate the kind of economic growth and create the employment that the congressman is talking about. However, the reality is that the countries of the Northern Triangle face some very significant social challenges that go beyond just jobs and economic prosperity. And some have been mentioned by Rick. But what's important to understand about the assistance that we have provided over the last several years, the assistance that's being cut, is that it was designed to align itself with the priorities that the countries themselves had established in order to address the origins of unregulated migration. In other words, this is a partnership, and it's one that we have done step by step with Guatemala, El Salvador, and with Honduras. But also, it's important to understand that the monies that have been expended through NGOs, both indigenous NGOs and NGOs selected by the U.S. Agency for International Development. And in this regard, money is not going into the government and is not being siphoned off. In fact, it's very tightly regulated and controlled, and this is something that our Congress insisted upon. So from my point of view, this aid is a catalytic infusion of money that's designed to address very specific problems while the countries of the Northern Triangle look for a way to build their economies, become more prosperous, and create the kind of jobs that the congressman was talking about.
With that in mind, Ambassador Shannon, the fact that you say that the money is not being siphoned off and it's actually working, if you look at it objectively, what is this about then? Why do you think the president's doing this? Because there are some who look at this cynically and say, well, all Trump is doing is he's campaigning for 2020, and ultimately he needs to keep an immigration crisis going on and on to keep it relevant for political purposes. Do you share that cynicism?
No, I don't. I don't think this is being driven cynically. I think he really is profoundly frustrated with what's happening along our frontier, and he's looking for solutions. I just think that for a solution to emerge, we really have to work with these countries in partnership. And the way we're going to have to do that is by directing assistance. But again, assistance that's well-defined and assistance that our Congress has set a series of criteria for. And I think in this regard, pulling that assistance at this point in time is sending a very harsh message to our partners. And as Rick noted, indicating that they're really kind of on their own. And that all we're going to really worry about is who shows up on our southwest border.
Right. And Rick, even though the president has said it emphatically, he hasn't signed an executive order as such, and there's been some pushback from Congress, from both sides, mostly from the Dems, but some Republicans as well. And there were also four-star senior military officials who wrote a letter to him saying this is a bad idea. With all of that in mind, are you possibly encouraged, Rick, that there'll be pushback to the extent that this can be recalibrated and there might be some sort of compromise here?
I think we're hopeful that we can see the impact, the positive impact of the aid that's been given to Central America on reducing homicide rates, on preventing stunting in children, on preparing young people for the workforce, on improving police tactics in Central America, and that will continue to carry the day. And really, we spend almost 10 times more on the southern border than we do on the aid that's actually working. And so I think, again, we need to improve the amount and increase the amount that we're sending to Central America, and recognize, as Ambassador Shannon has pointed out, this is a shared responsibility. The gangs in Central America actually were born in Los Angeles, and all of the countries together are fighting the drug war. And removing the aid at this point really will inhibit the capacity of Central America to continue to combat those issues and respond for the most vulnerable. These programs are really reaching the most vulnerable people who are also the most likely to migrate. And I think we need to keep that front and center.
Fernando, the president has even threatened to go a step further and close the border, whatever that means, however practically possible that might be. Would you support that?
No, I wouldn't support it, but it's already closed for illegal immigration. However, the rule of law does not apply. Look, if you look at private property, if someone comes into your backyard, squats there, they're committing a crime. If they go into the States, what happens to them? They get turned back. But for it, can prevent President Trump from doing that. He can turn them back. Is there a rule of law? Is there an action that's considered a felony to squat on U.S. soil? Because I consider equal to squatting on private property. But something that comes out regarding the design of these policies, sure, the good intentions come from Congress, but from Congress in Washington, D.C., all the way to Guatemala, there's a long, long road. And the results aren't what sometimes you expect them to be. Look, I've been on the receiving end. I myself have been a victim, for example, of intervention by ex-ambassador, not Mr. Shannon, but my Mr. Robinson, who uses influence of revoking visas to place people in high positions in the courts, therefore creating lawfare. And he also tried to promote constitutional reforms. Look, and Rick says about the NGOs. Sure, a lot of the NGOs get the money, but they put in what they think is right and universal world order, such as gender ideology. We have a lot of that coming from USID. So the US people, the population, the taxpayers are paying for intervention in our country with gender ideology. And Rick says the homicide rate has been reduced in El Salvador, but he's stating that there's a causal relationship between the reduction of the homicide rate and I could sarcastically say, the reason homicide reduction has been lower in the recent years is because most of those causing the homicides have migrated to the U.S.
All right. Okay. Fair point. Correlation doesn't mean causation. And hopefully we can debate this further another time. But I have to move on. Gentlemen, it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. Rick Jones, Ambassador Thomas Shannon, and Congressman Fernando Linares Beltranena, thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
So cruel and so barbaric. It's designed to prolong the agonized death of the person. This has no place in the 21st century. So we're saying boycott the Dorchester Hotel and all the businesses worldwide owned by the Sultan, including his regime's flagship, Royal Brunei Airlines.
In Brunei, homosexual sex and adultery are offences now punishable with death by stoning. This extreme interpretation of Islamic law came into effect last week. It sparked protests and condemnation from Western nations and celebrities who are urging a boycott of the Sultan's businesses. The UN has appealed to the kingdom to stop what it calls the cruel and inhuman punishment. But the lack of response from neighboring Muslim-majority countries has sent fear across LGBT communities in the region that a crackdown could spread. Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Geneva by Mona Rishmawi. She's the head of the Rule of Law, Equality and Non-Discrimination Branch at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And in Singapore is Assistant Professor Nawab Osman, who researches Southeast Asian Islamic political movements at the Rajaratnam School of International Studies. Good to have you both on the program. Mona, when you came across the news of the new law, what was your immediate reaction?
My immediate reaction is that this is really very cruel, especially in a country which has been upholding the moratorium on death penalty since 1957. Brunei Dar es Salaam did not carry out this penalty. So to legislate since 1957, so to legislate now such a cruel punishment for offenses that are non-violent and they are not considered serious is really very, very sad.
Mohammed Nawab Osman, one of the questions that everybody's asking is, why is the Sultan doing this now? What's behind it? What does he gain from it at all?
No, I think that the policy is not, the implementation is fairly new, but the policy is not. I think the announcement that was made, in fact, with regards to the implementation of Islamic law occurred much earlier in about 2008. Now, there are numerous theories to why perhaps the Sultan might want to do this. The first being that the Bruneian economy is not doing great. The sort of free taxation system that's in place, various goodies like free housing or and so on that have been offered to placate the Bruneian population are perhaps policies that they are unable to continue. Unemployment rate is up, so all these factors could lead to the unpopularity of the regime. We have to remember this is an absolute monarchy.
Right.
There's
Nawab,
no free
allow me to come in here for a second, right? And sorry to interrupt you, right? So let's say this is possible, that he's unpopular. How is he going to gain popularity by introducing the death penalty for gay sex or adultery? Are you honestly telling me that people are going to say, well, you're our savior, thanks for taking care of the gays and the adulterers? Is that what the people of Brunei actually think?
No, I mean that, and I'm not saying that he is unpopular necessarily. I think there is a fear on his part, on that of the ruling regime, that he might begin to lose support. Now, we need to understand that the Bruneian population, the Muslim population, is a very conservative country. There is a rising sense, not just in Brunei, but in Muslim majority countries such as Malaysia and Indonesia, support for more conservative Islamic law is rising. It's unfortunate, but many Muslims support these kind of laws, believing that it will make them better Muslims or create a better Muslim society, which is unfortunate. But these ideas actually have some traction with certain groups of people.
I wonder what you think, Mona, if we look at it from the perspective of this interpretation of Islamic law or Sharia, if you go down that road with the government of Brunei and the Sultan, is it of any consolation to you that a part of the package is that people need 4 eyewitnesses to witness the act in order to carry out the punishment, which might suggest that even though the law on the books is against the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and it looks very ugly, however, it's very unlikely that anyone will actually be stoned to death for this?
Let me just start from perhaps with a different point. Let's start. I would like to start that there is no contradiction between faith and rights and belief and rights. Actually, all faiths in the world, most faiths in the world are about compassion and about caring for the vulnerable, is about establishing justice for all, and these kind of very important ideas. And therefore, this kind of very harsh draconian laws often really target the vulnerable. If you are very rich and you can afford a very good lawyer, you can afford, legal defense, adequate legal defense, normally things work for you. So the people who will mostly be caught by these laws are the people who are already vulnerable, are already undergoing a lot of difficulties. Therefore, there is a basic issue of justice. Go after the most vulnerable of the society to make a point that is really about how the state cares for itself and cares for the religion. I don't think any religion would actually sanction that. Again, for us, Brunei Dar es Salaam is a moratorium country for many decades now, for about 80 years. It's really not for us legislate today on death penalty, to add more death penalty crimes is really not the way to go. This is happening at the time when the world is moving away from death penalty.
Right.
In the last, in New York, is a resolution that comes every year in the General Assembly on death penalty, and we are seeing more and more countries actually subscribe to the abolition and the moratorium on death.
I want to bring in Nawab Osman here. So we've seen protests, and we've been looking at some of the pictures of protests, especially after it was made clear. Initially, I think people got the news from celebrities who were boycotting the chain of hotels supported by the Sultan or owned by the Sultan. I mean, I find it really hard to believe that the Sultan doesn't think that adultery and or gay sex happens in his hotels in the Dorchester or in Beverly Hills and so on. Is it going to make a difference when they boycott him and they say, we're not going to support your hotels? Is it going to make a difference at all?
I personally don't think that it's really going to make a difference, because the motivation for this is highly political, and it's really aimed at gaining political mileage. If anything, you know, when you have these boycotts happening, these demonstrations occurring, the Sultan can go back to his people and, you know, sell this notion that somehow the world is against us, the world is against us implementing Islam, and he's obviously not the first Muslim leader to have used the religious card for those purposes. And if anything, it probably might gain him more sympathy. Already, I mean, if you look at the responses from more conservative groups in both Indonesia and Malaysia, they have come out in support, congratulating the Sultan and the country for implementing the law. So I think that, if anything, it will gain him even more political mileage.
Okay, some interesting and perhaps ominous things bubbling at the moment. We'll keep a close eye on this. Mona Rishmawi and Nawab Osman for the moment. Let me thank you. I have to move on. Thanks again. And that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. Check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, we look at the results of the Israeli election and debate what it means for the future of the region. Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.